As the sun began its descent on July 8, 2024, the Komarov family ventured into the heart of the Siberian wilderness. The day was warm, and the forest teemed with the hum of insects and the rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze. For Igor Komarov and his family, this trip was an escape from their hectic lives, a chance to reconnect with nature. Igor, a sturdy man in his late 40s with rugged strength, had long dreamed of showing his children the untouched beauty of Russia's wilds. His wife Alina, a quiet but resilient schoolteacher, shared his enthusiasm. Their children, 12-year-old Victor and 10-year-old Anya, were brimming with curiosity and excitement for the adventure. The journey to their campsite had been long and arduous, involving treks through dense forest and across winding rivers. They finally arrived at a secluded clearing surrounded by towering pines, offering a breathtaking view of distant mountains. There were no signs of civilization, just the Komarovs and the vast Siberian wilderness. As they set up camp, the children gathered firewood and explored their surroundings under their parents' watchful eyes. The crisp, fresh air was filled with the scent of pine needles and the earthy aroma of the forest floor. Igor, skilled in outdoor survival, built a fire pit, while Alina unpacked provisions, spreading bread, cheese, and cured meats on a blanket. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the clearing, the family settled down for dinner. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks into the cool evening air. The aroma of cooking meat mingled with the forest's scents, carried away on the breeze. Unbeknownst to the Komarovs, a massive grizzly bear in the distance had picked up the scent of their meal. This creature, perfectly adapted to its harsh environment, was driven by a relentless hunger. It moved silently through the underbrush, its dark fur blending with the forest floor. The bear's acute senses allowed it to detect the faint sounds of laughter and see the flickering firelight between the trees. With each step, it drew closer. The Komarovs, oblivious to the danger, continued their meal as the light faded and the forest grew quieter. The usual sounds of wildlife diminished as nocturnal creatures began to stir. The fire's glow created a small island of warmth and comfort in the encroaching darkness. The bear was now so close it could smell the sweat on their skin and the faint hint of fear. It paused at the edge of the clearing, its eyes gleaming in the firelight as it observed the family with a predatory intelligence. Then, with a burst of speed that belied its size, the bear charged forward, crashing through the underbrush. The attack was sudden and ferocious. The bear lunged into the clearing, a force of nature that shattered the calm. The Komarovs had mere seconds to react. Igor, nearest the fire, was the first to recognize the danger. His heart raced as he turned, realizing the gravity of the situation. In that critical moment, his thoughts were consumed with protecting his family. As the bear closed in, chaos erupted. The once serene evening was now a tumult of primal fear and desperate action. The family scrambled to react, their evening of relaxation turning into a fight for survival against a relentless predator. Instinctively, Igor grabbed a burning log from the fire, brandishing it like a weapon. The bear, undeterred, met his defiance with a roar that shook the very trees. It swiped at him with a paw the size of a dinner plate. Claws extended, the blow connected with Igor's chest, sending him sprawling backward with air driven from his lungs. Pain exploded through his body, but there was no time to dwell on it. He had to fight. Alina screamed a sound that echoed in the vast emptiness around them as she tried to shield the children. But the bear was relentless, its hunger and fury driving it to tear into anything that moved. Igor struggled to his feet, ignoring the blood that soaked his shirt, and swung the burning log at the bear's face. The flames licked at its fur, singeing the tips, but the bear barely flinched. Instead, it reared up on its hind legs, towering over Igor, and brought both of its massive paws down with a force that could shatter bone. Igor collapsed under the blow, the log falling from his hands as he crumpled to the ground. The bear turned its attention to Alina and the children, who were frozen in place, their eyes wide with terror. For a brief moment, the clearing was filled with a terrible silence, the kind that precedes an inescapable doom. Then the bear attacked again, its primal instincts taking over as it closed in on the remaining members of the Komarov family. Alina tried to shield her children, using her body as a barrier between them and the beast. But the bear was unstoppable, its jaws snapping at anything within reach. It struck Alina with a force that sent her tumbling to the ground, her body limp as she hit the earth. Victor and Anya, too young to comprehend the full horror of what was happening, could do nothing but watch as the bear's rage was unleashed upon them. The animal's immense power was overwhelming, and in mere minutes the lives of the Komarov family were extinguished in a flurry of violence and blood. The bear, hunger-sated, dragged the bodies into the forest, leaving the once serene campsite a scene of unimaginable carnage. The fire continued to burn, casting flickering shadows on the trees as if the forest itself mourned the loss of the lives it had claimed. When local hunters arrived the next day, they were met with a profound silence. The clearing, once alive with the sounds of a family and nature, was now a grim tableau of death. The brutal remains of the Komarovs were scattered, torn apart by the bear's ferocity, and the ground was stained with blood. The hunters, seasoned in the wild's harsh realities, followed the bloodied trail more into the forest, their faces etched with grim determination. Knowing the bear, having tasted human flesh, would now be more dangerous, they proceeded cautiously. They eventually found the bear resting in a thicket, its bloodied fur marking its recent violence. The immense beast, with eyes reflecting primal intelligence, was a formidable threat. With heavy hearts, the hunters ended the bear's life, eliminating the danger it posed. News of the Komarov family's tragic end quickly spread, shaking the region. The incident underscored the lethal risks of remote wilderness, highlighting Siberia's brutal reality, where only the strong survive, and even then, survival is never assured. The Arctic, with its vast expanse of ice and extreme conditions, is a realm where only the most resilient survive. Polar bears, apex predators in this unforgiving environment, face the harshest of challenges. A month-long expedition led by seasoned explorers aimed to document the effects of climate change in this hostile region. The team was aware of the dangers: biting cold, shifting ice, unpredictable weather, and the looming threat of polar bears. The team comprised 5 members: Graham, the experienced expedition leader; Aubrey, the young climatologist; Derek, a marine biologist studying the region's wildlife; Andrei, an Arctic photographer; and Lamar, an expert in glaciology. Their mission was clear: gather crucial data on the Arctic's changing conditions. Each day, they ventured onto the ice, meticulously documenting the transformations occurring in the environment. Every aspect of the expedition was planned with precision. The team was equipped with cutting-edge thermal imaging technology, durable tents, flare guns, and early warning systems for detecting large animals. Yet, in the unpredictable Arctic, even the best-laid plans could falter. As the weeks progressed, the team observed alarming changes. Ice floes, once solid and stable, now cracked and drifted more frequently. Temperature fluctuations were more extreme, and wildlife sightings were scarce. Derek noted the absence of seals, a critical prey for polar bears. This absence suggested that hungry bears might become increasingly desperate and aggressive. One evening, while setting up camp on a drifting ice floe, the team was enveloped by the dim light of Arctic twilight. The horizon was a vast white expanse, occasionally interrupted by distant icebergs. Despite the serene appearance, there was an underlying tension. The day's grim findings had added weight to their mission. The team worked swiftly to establish their camp. They chose the floe for its stability, but were aware that the ice's unpredictability required them to remain alert and ready to move. Graham, ever vigilant, ensured that tripwires and flares were correctly placed, knowing that their presence might attract the Arctic's apex predators. As night fell and temperatures plummeted, the team huddled in their main tent, analyzing the day's data and planning for the days ahead. The floe's increasing drift added urgency to their discussions. They needed to act strategically to complete their mission before the end of the expedition. Unbeknownst to the team, a large male polar bear was prowling the floe's edges. Driven by hunger and desperation, the bear had been traversing the ice for days in search of seals. The bear's acute sense of smell had detected the explorer's scent from afar, guiding it toward their camp with relentless determination. The bear, its thick fur blending with the ice, approached the camp stealthily. The explorers remained unaware of the predator's presence, focusing on their work and discussions. The Arctic's vast and silent expanse held both beauty and danger, a constant reminder of the wilderness's unpredictability. As the bear approached the camp, it moved with a cautious, almost stealthy gait. It knew the terrain well, navigating the cracks and crevices in the ice with ease. The bear's massive paws, designed for traction on the slippery surface, made barely a sound. Its sharp and alert eyes scanned the camp, taking in the tents and the equipment. The bear could sense the presence of the humans, and its instincts were on high alert. Inside the tent, the team remained oblivious to the danger lurking outside. They were focused on their work, unaware that the bear had drawn dangerously close. The tripwires and flares, their first line of defense, were in place, but the bear, driven by hunger, was undeterred. It circled the camp, its nostrils flaring as it picked up the scent of food and human sweat. The bear's muscles tensed, its predatory instincts kicking in as it prepared to strike. As the night deepened, Graham decided to check the camp's perimeter one last time before turning in. He stepped out into the frigid air, his breath visible in the cold. He moved methodically, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, scanning for any signs of movement. He knew that in the Arctic, vigilance was essential to us, survival. But the bear, sensing the movement, had already set its sights on a different target. Lamar had ventured out to retrieve some equipment from a sled that had been left near the edge of the camp. He moved quickly, wanting to get back inside where it was warm. But as he approached the sled, the bear, driven by its primal need to feed, made its move. The attack was swift and brutal, a blur of motion in the dark. The polar bear lunged at Lamar with a force that belied its size, its mighty jaws clamping down on his shoulder and driving him to the ground. Lamar's survival instincts surged, but the bear's overwhelming strength made resistance nearly impossible. Its claws tore through his clothing and flesh, inflicting excruciating pain that radiated through his body. Lamar struggled, his hands flailing uselessly against the bear's thick fur. The creature's grip was relentless, its teeth sinking deeper with each second. His mind was a chaotic swirl of pain, fear, and disbelief. Despite his awareness of the risks and his preparedness for a potential encounter, nothing could have readied him for this brutal reality. The rest of the team heard the commotion and rushed outside, but by the time they reached Lamar, it was too late. The bear, sensing their approach, emitted a deep guttural growl that echoed across the ice. With a final, savage shake of its head, it dragged Lamar's lifeless body away into the darkness. The team was left in shock, struggling to process the horror of what had occurred. The icy wind carried the scent of blood, and the bear's growl, a grim reminder of their vulnerability. They realized that pursuing the bear would only lead to further tragedy. The stark reality of their situation hit hard. They were alone in one of Earth's most remote and unforgiving regions, at the mercy of a predator with no compassion. Seeking refuge, they retreated to their emergency shelter, a reinforced tent designed for extreme conditions, but offering little solace in the face of such violence. Huddled together, they shivered from both the cold and the raw fear that gripped them. The air was thick with shock, each member haunted by the memory of Lamar's screams. Graham, the leader, knew immediate action was necessary. He ordered an evacuation and sent out a distress call to their support team stationed miles away. The support team, well-versed in Arctic dangers, responded swiftly. Yet even as preparations for evacuation began, the weight of Lamar's loss hung heavily over them. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as they awaited rescue. The ordinarily peaceful Arctic sounds now felt ominous, as if the ice itself was closing in on them. The bear's attack had left a searing mark on their minds, a constant reminder of the peril that lurked in the Arctic's icy expanse. Their unity, once their strength, now felt fragile in the face of such a devastating loss. When the rescue team arrived, the explorers were physically unharmed, but emotionally shattered. They had come to the Arctic to study climate change and witness the environment's transformations. Still, instead, they were confronted with the brutal reality of survival in one of the planet's harshest landscapes. Rachel, drawn to the wild, had always found solace in the Sierra Nevada mountains with their rugged peaks and shadowy valleys. The allure of solitude and the challenge of navigating this terrain had long captivated her. Well prepared and experienced, she had meticulously studied maps, learned trails, and readied herself for any scenario. On this particular morning, the sky was a brilliant, endless blue. Rachel chose a remote trail she had hiked before, winding through thick pine forests and beside crystal-clear lakes where solitude reigned and only nature's sounds were present. As she walked, Rachel remained vigilant, aware of the wildlife that inhabited the Sierra Nevada. Armed with bear spray, a whistle, and a knife, she followed safety protocols to avoid startling a bear. The day was uneventful until she entered a shaded stretch and spotted a large black bear about 20 yards away. The bear, moving slowly, seemed unaware of her presence. Rachel froze and reached for her bear spray, her hand trembling. Unlike previous encounters, this bear did not retreat, but instead locked eyes with her, signaling a potentially dangerous situation. The bear's eyes were dark and unblinking. Rachel felt a surge of adrenaline as the bear took a step toward her. She tried to remember her training. Stay calm, don't run, make yourself look more prominent. But the bear wasn't following the usual script. It didn't pause, didn't hesitate. It kept coming, a low, menacing growl rumbling from deep within its chest. Rachel slowly began to back away, her heart pounding in her ears. The bear followed, its massive paws crunching on the forest floor. She raised her arms, trying to appear larger, trying to dissuade the bear from advancing, but the bear's demeanor had shifted. There was no fear, no curiosity, only aggression. She fumbled with the bear spray, her fingers clumsy with fear. The bear was close now. Too close. Rachel knew she was in grave danger. She aimed the spray and squeezed the trigger, releasing a cloud of fiery mist directly into the bear's face. The bear recoiled, shaking its head and snorting. For a brief moment, Rachel thought she had succeeded. The bear staggered back, pawing at its face. But the relief was short-lived. The bear, enraged by the burning in its eyes and nose, let out a roar and charged. Rachel barely had time to react. The bear barreled into her with the force of a freight train, knocking her off her feet. She hit the ground hard, the wind driven from her lungs in a painful rush. The bear was on her in an instant, its massive weight pinning her down. Rachel fought with everything she had. She kicked and thrashed, trying to push the bear off of her. She could feel the bear's hot breath on her face and smell the musky scent of its fur. The bear's claws raked across her chest, tearing through her jacket and into her flesh. She screamed in pain, a raw, primal sound that echoed through the trees. The bear's jaws closed around her arm, its teeth sinking deep into her flesh. She tried to pull free, but the bear's grip was like a vice, unrelenting and merciless. Every instinct in Rachel's body screamed at her to fight, to survive. She swung her free arm at the bear, hitting it with weak, desperate blows. She reached for the knife at her side, her fingers slick with blood as she fumbled to pull it from its sheath. The bear shook its head, tearing into her arm, and Rachel's vision blurred with the pain. With a final surge of strength, she managed to draw the knife. She stabbed at the bear's side, driving the blade into its thick hide. The bear roared, a sound of fury and pain. It reared back, releasing her arm, and Rachel seized the opportunity. She tried to crawl away, dragging herself across the ground, but her body was broken, her strength sapped. The bear lunged at Rachel, knocking her to the ground with a powerful swipe. Dazed, she saw the bear's massive form blotting out the sky, its bloodied muzzle dripping with her blood. Realizing her fate, Rachel fought with a knife, but her strikes were ineffective. The bear casually knocked the knife from her hand and clamped its jaws around her neck. The excruciating pain overwhelmed her, and darkness began to close in as her heart pounded fiercely. As the bear's grip tightened, Rachel's thoughts turned to her family, the mountains she loved, and the countless times she had walked these trails. Then, everything faded away. Later that day, other hikers found Rachel's body, having heard the struggle and the bear's roars, but arriving too late. The community was shocked by the tragedy, mourning the loss of a seasoned hiker. Authorities set up patrols and issued warnings, ultimately tracking and euthanizing the bear for public safety. Rachel's death was a sad reminder of the wild's unpredictable danger. The forest of British Columbia stretched endlessly, a labyrinth of towering firs and cedars cloaked in the quiet weight of winter's first natural snowfall. Each tree stood like a sentinel, their branches heavy with pristine white, creating an almost sacred stillness. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional groan of the wind weaving between the trunks and the faint rustle of snow dislodged from the canopy. It was a wilderness both beautiful and forbidding, where isolation pressed in on the senses like the cold. Jack, a 24-year-old logger with a wiry frame and a streak of stubborn independence, had chosen this isolation deliberately. His battered camper sat parked near the logging site, a reasonable distance away from the bustling main camp. It was his sanctuary, a place where he could decompress from the day's grueling work without the distractions of human company. Here, surrounded by the vast, untamed forest, he felt a mix of reverence and unease, a tension that kept him on edge even as it soothed him. That day had been particularly punishing, and hours of felling trees had left Jack's muscles aching, his hands vibrating long after he'd set down the chainsaw. The work was grueling, demanding precision and strength, but Jack thrived on the challenge. By the time evening rolled in, he was too exhausted to do more than heat a can of chili on his portable stove. He ate quickly, the warm meal barely registering against the cold seeping into the camper. When he finished, he tossed the pot into the sink, leaving it for tomorrow. He crawled into his narrow cot, pulling a thick woolen blanket up to his chin as the temperature outside plummeted. Snowflakes tapped softly against the camper's windows, a rhythmic lullaby that soon sent him into a deep sleep. The night was heavy with silence until a metallic groan jolted Jack awake. Disoriented, he sat up, his breath visible in the icy air. For a moment, he thought he'd dreamed it. Then it came again, louder, a screech of metal straining under pressure. The sound sent a cold spike of fear through him. Something, or someone, was outside. Straining to listen, he caught the faint huffing and snuffling of an animal, the sound too significant to dismiss. His heart hammered in his chest as the realization dawned. A predator was investigating his camper. The next sound was unmistakable. A massive force slammed against the door, shaking the camper violently. Jack scrambled to his feet, the cot creaking beneath him. Another blow followed, the hinges shrieking under the strain. The door bent inward, its frame splintering with a sharp crack. Before Jack could react, it gave way entirely, crashing to the floor in a burst of noise and cold air. In the doorway stood a grizzly bear, its enormous form framed by the swirling snow. Its fur was dusted with white, its breath steaming in the freezing air, and its eyes gleamed with primal hunger. The bear stepped inside, its bulk making the camper's interior feel impossibly cramped. The stench of the animal filled the space. The bear sniffed the air, its massive head swiveling toward the sink, where the remnants of chili lingered in the unwashed pot. It advanced, knocking over a chair with a casual swipe of its paw. The sound was deafening in the confined space. Jack's instincts screamed at him to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The camper's layout boxed him in. The table and sink were on one side, the cot on the other. His eyes darted to the fire extinguisher mounted near the stove, a potential lifeline. But before he could move, the bear shifted its focus to him. Its gaze locked onto him, and in a terrifying instant, it lunged. The bear's weight crashed into Jack, slamming him against the wall. Pain exploded in his leg as its claws tore through his jeans, ripping flesh with horrifying ease. The sharp tang of blood filled the air, mingling with the animal's musk. Jack gasped, his vision blurring from the shock and the searing pain. Desperation surged through him, overriding the agony. His hand groped for anything within reach, and his fingers closed around the fire extinguisher's cold metal handle. With every ounce of strength he had left, Jack wrenched the extinguisher free from its mount and aimed it at the bear's face. He squeezed the trigger, unleashing a torrent of white foam. The cloud engulfed the bear's head, stinging its eyes and nose. The animal reared back with a furious roar, its claws slashing wildly as it shook its head, trying to rid itself of the suffocating spray. The momentary distraction was all Jack needed. Ignoring the fire in his leg, he dragged himself toward the window. The camper groaned under his movements. He shoved the glass pane open and pulled himself through, landing awkwardly in the snow. The freezing air hit him like a physical blow, but he welcomed it. Crawling through the snow, he put as much distance as he could between himself and the camper. Behind him, the bear's enraged roars filled the night, mingling with the creak of the camper as it shifted under the animal's weight. The forest loomed around him, its shadows deep and unfriendly. Jack's breaths came in ragged gasps as he dragged his injured leg through the snow, leaving a faint trail of blood on the pristine white surface. His clothes were soaked, the cold seeping into his bones, but he pushed forward. In the distance, the faint glow of his colleagues' campsite lights flickered through the trees, a fragile beacon of hope. Each movement sent fresh waves of pain through his body, his vision narrowing to a tunnel of snow, darkness, and distant light. The bear's roars grew fainter, replaced by the sound of his labored breathing and the crunch of snow beneath him. Minutes stretched into an eternity before he finally reached the campsite. Collapsing near the central fire pit, he barely registered the warmth of the flames before his world went black. Jack awoke in a hospital bed, his leg heavily bandaged and his body aching in ways he hadn't thought possible. The doctors told him he'd lost a significant amount of blood but would recover. His colleagues had found him unconscious by the fire, following his blood trail back to the shattered remains of his camper. The bear, they speculated, had retreated into the woods once the camper offered nothing more to scavenge. The scars on Jack's leg were jagged reminders of the encounter, a permanent testament to his survival. Yet, as the weeks passed and his wounds healed, he felt an inexplicable pull back to the wilderness. The forest that had nearly killed him still held its magnetic allure, its beauty undiminished by the danger it posed. The morning air in the wilderness of Wyoming was crisp and filled with the earthy scent of pine and damp soil. Kara Morrison, an experienced solo hiker with years of outdoor adventures under her belt, set out early, her boots crunching against the frost-kissed trail. She reveled in the solitude, feeling as though the forest breathed around her, the towering lodgepole pines standing as silent sentinels. Her pack was well stocked with essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, and bear spray clipped within easy reach. She knew the risks of hiking alone in bear country, but trusted her knowledge and preparation. The trail wound deeper into the wilderness, and as the sun rose higher, the frost melted into glistening dew. Kara felt invigorated, her muscles humming with the steady rhythm of movement. She noted fresh claw marks on a nearby tree and a patch of disturbed earth, a reminder of whose territory she was in. But she pressed on, her footsteps careful, her senses attuned to the environment. It happened in an instant. As Kara rounded a bend, her gaze caught movement ahead. Just 30 yards from the trail stood a grizzly bear, its hulking frame unmistakable. Two cubs, no more than a few months old, trailed beside it, their playful antics contrasting sharply with the mother's rigid posture. Kara froze, her breath catching in her throat. The bear's dark eyes locked onto her, its body tense. It huffed loudly, a sound that resonated deep in Kara's chest, and stamped its massive front paw. The universal warning was clear: she was too close, and the bear perceived her as a threat to its cubs. Kara knew better than to run. Slowly, she began to back away, her hand moving to the bear spray clipped to her belt. Then, the grizzly charged. The ground seemed to shake as the bear thundered toward her, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Kara fumbled with the bear spray, her fingers trembling as she tried to aim. Just as the bear reached her, she managed to depress the trigger, a cloud of orange mist erupting between them. The bear reared back briefly, its roar deafening, but the deterrent wasn't enough. Driven by maternal instinct and fury, the grizzly lunged through the lingering haze. The impact knocked Kara off her feet. The force of the bear's charge sent her sprawling onto the rocky trail. Pain exploded in her shoulder as she landed hard, the sharp edge of a stone digging into her back. The bear was on her in an instant, its massive paw slashing across her torso. The claws tore through her jacket and into her flesh, leaving deep, ragged gashes that oozed blood. Kara screamed, the sound raw and primal, but there was no one around to hear. She tried to shield herself, her arms coming up instinctively to protect her face. The bear's claws raked across her forearms, shredding her skin and leaving her limbs limp and useless. Blood splattered the ground, bright red against the dirt and leaves. The grizzly bit down on her thigh, its mighty jaws crushing muscle and bone. Kara thrashed beneath it, her survival instincts overriding the agony. She kicked at the bear with her uninjured leg, her boot connecting with its side, but it only seemed to enrage the animal further. The attack was relentless. The grizzly's weight pinned her to the ground, its claws and teeth tearing through her with ruthless efficiency. Her movements grew weaker as blood loss sapped her strength, her vision blurring at the edges. Desperate, she reached for her pack, hoping for anything that could save her, but the bear swatted it aside, scattering its contents across the trail. Kara's body grew still as shock set in, her mind slipping into a haze. The bear, its fury abating, paused its attack. It stood over her, breath hot and heavy, nostrils flaring as it sniffed her motionless form. For a moment it seemed as though it might leave her there, broken but alive. But then one of the cubs mewled from nearby, and the mother turned back to Kara, swiping at her once more with a final, brutal blow that left her chest torn open. Satisfied, the bear lumbered off into the underbrush, its cubs following close behind. The forest fell silent again, save for the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Kara's body lay sprawled on the trail, her blood soaking into the earth. Her once vibrant form was now lifeless, a stark reminder of nature's power and ferocity. The following day, a search and rescue team found her after she failed to check in, raising alarms. They discovered her remains surrounded by scattered belongings. Her pack, bear spray canister, and a trail of blood leading to where the attack had taken place. The claw marks and tracks around her told the story clearly. She had fought valiantly to survive, but the odds had been impossible. News of Kara's death spread quickly, a tragic story that underscored the risks of solo hiking in grizzly territory. Park officials issued stronger warnings, advising hikers to travel in groups, avoid areas with recent bear activity, and always carry bear spray. Yet the reality remained. In the wilderness, even the best preparations could not guarantee safety. Kara's family would later describe her as fearless, someone who loved the outdoors and respected its beauty and dangers in equal measure. Her death served as a grim reminder of nature's untamed power, a harsh, unforgiving force that demanded both caution and reverence. As the sun set over the forest's rugged landscape, casting its golden light over the trails, the woods remained indifferent, its cycle of life and death continuing as it always had. Chugach Mountains unfolded endlessly before Marcus Reed, a sprawling wilderness of rugged peaks, dense forests, and icy streams. The early morning sunlight filtered through the canopy of towering evergreens, casting golden beams onto the narrow dirt trail that snaked upward. For Marcus, an experienced trail runner and lover of the wild, these solitary excursions were both a test of endurance and a communion with nature's raw beauty. He relished the challenge of remote routes, places few dared to tread, and the sense of peace that came with them. This route, known for its treacherous inclines and isolated stretches, was particularly demanding. The trail twisted through alpine meadows, over rock-strewn passes, and into shadowy thickets where every step required focus. Marcus carried only the essentials: a hydration vest, energy gels, and a small first aid kit. He chose not to carry bear spray, a precaution he had often dismissed as unnecessary. His reasoning was simple: his speed and sharp awareness of his surroundings would be enough. The morning air was crisp. The only sounds were the rhythmic crunch of Marcus's running shoes on the dirt and the occasional rustle of a squirrel darting through the underbrush. His breathing was steady as he tackled the trail's steeper sections, the pounding of his heart in rhythm with the wild pulse of the landscape. The forest around him seemed alive yet tranquil, a shifting mosaic of light and shadow. But Marcus was not alone. Further along the trail, hidden in a thicket of undergrowth, a massive brown bear foraged for food. Its hulking frame moved with quiet power as it stripped berries from low-hanging branches, oblivious to the distant footsteps approaching. The bear was in its element, a dominant presence in the wilderness that Marcus had entered. As Marcus rounded a sharp bend, his sudden appearance shattered the bear's momentary peace. The massive animal froze, its dark, intelligent eyes locking onto the runner. It rose slightly on its hind legs, ears flattening as it assessed the unfamiliar figure. For a split second, neither moved. Then the bear let out a thunderous roar, a primal sound that reverberated through the forest. Marcus's mind raced, trying to recall the advice for such encounters. Don't run, don't panic. But instinct overruled logic. His body reacted before he could think, and he turned and ran, sprinting back down the trail with every ounce of strength he possessed. The uneven terrain that had felt exhilarating moments before now betrayed him, each step threatening to send him sprawling. Behind him, the bear thundered forward, its massive paws shaking the earth as it gave chase. The animal closed the distance in mere seconds. With terrifying speed, it lunged, striking Marcus with a swipe of its paw. The force sent him tumbling to the ground, dirt and debris flying as he landed hard. Pain exploded across his back where the bear's claws had raked deep gashes into his flesh. Disoriented and gasping for breath, Marcus scrambled to rise, but the bear was already upon him. The beast's weight pinned him down, the musky scent of its fur suffocating. Marcus twisted and thrashed beneath it, trying to fend off the relentless assault. His hands scrabbled for anything that could serve as a weapon, finally closing around a jagged rock. He swung upward with desperate force, striking the bear's snout. The impact caused the animal to recoil momentarily, but the reprieve was brief. Enraged, the bear roared and resumed its attack, slamming its claws into Marcus's legs with terrifying precision. The pain was excruciating, but adrenaline numbed him just enough to keep fighting. The bear's jaws clamped onto his arm, the sickening crunch of bone echoing in his ears. Marcus screamed, his free hand clawing at the ground as the animal dragged him several feet across the trail. Blood pooled beneath him, staining the dirt a vivid red. Each movement sent new waves of agony through his battered body, but he refused to stop struggling. The bear's ferocity was unrelenting. It tore into his torso, its claws rending flesh from bone. Marcus's screams grew weaker as his body succumbed to the onslaught, his strength draining with every passing second. His vision blurred, the world around him fading into a haze of pain and terror. Finally, the bear paused. Whether satisfied or simply disinterested, it stepped back, its breath heavy and ragged. For a moment it stood over Marcus's motionless form, its dark eyes scanning the trail. Then, without warning, it turned and lumbered back into the forest, vanishing into the shadows as suddenly as it had appeared. The trail fell silent once more. The only sounds were the faint rustling of leaves and the shallow, labored breaths of Marcus as he lay broken and bleeding on the ground. Hours passed before anyone came. A group of hikers stumbled upon the scene, their joyful chatter turning to horrified gasps as they saw the bloodied figure sprawled across the trail. Marcus's body was mangled, his clothes torn, and his gear scattered. The ground around him told the story of a desperate struggle. Claw marks scored deep into the dirt, blood spattered across the rocks and leaves. The hikers acted quickly, calling for help and doing what little they could to stabilize him. Search and rescue teams arrived hours later, airlifting Marcus to a nearby hospital. Against all odds, he survived the attack, though his injuries were catastrophic. Multiple surgeries were needed to mend shattered bones and torn muscles, and the emotional scars ran as deep as the physical ones. The man who had once reveled in the solitude of the wild now bore the weight of its brutality. Wildlife officials launched an investigation into the attack, tracking the bear based on the signs it had left behind. Days later, they located and captured the animal, a large male with a scarred muzzle and blood-stained claws. The decision to euthanize the bear sparked controversy but was deemed necessary to prevent further danger to humans. Marcus's story spread quickly through the outdoor community, igniting debates about safety in the wilderness. Runners and hikers alike were reminded of the risks inherent in venturing into remote areas, no matter how experienced or prepared they believed themselves to be. Many began carrying bear spray or opting for more populated trails, unwilling to take the same risks. For Marcus, the wilderness he had once loved became a source of ambivalence. He carried the scars of that fateful day not only on his body but in his soul. Yet, as he recovered, he found himself drawn back to the mountains, determined to reclaim a part of what he had lost. Tom Hensley had always prided himself on his ability to navigate the wild. At 42, with decades of hiking experience, he had faced blistering heat, torrential rain, and the raw cold of desolate mountains. The Alaskan wilderness was his latest challenge, a vast expanse of untamed beauty where rivers carved through jagged valleys and snow-dusted peaks loomed like ancient sentinels. It was where man was insignificant, and that insignificance drew him in. He prepared meticulously, layers of thermal gear, a sharp knife, a high-powered bear spray, and a GPS device. He didn't account for a predator that played by its own rules. On October 25, 2024, Tom left his cabin near the Denali foothills and began his trek. For 3 days, he followed a route that wound through spruce forests and open tundra, relishing the isolation. The absence of cell service wasn't a problem. He carried a satellite beacon for emergencies. He camped each night under a canopy of stars, the silence broken only by the whispers of wind and the occasional howl of a distant wolf. His mind was at peace, and his movements were efficient. The wilderness was brutal, but it was predictable, or so he thought. It began on the morning of October 28th. Tom was traversing a narrow ridge when he noticed deep furrows in the dirt, claw marks unmistakably fresh. He paused, scanning his surroundings. The stillness was disconcerting. No bird calls, no rustling leaves. A faint unease prickled his neck. He knew the signs of an apex predator's territory, but it wasn't until he descended into the valley that he saw the massive prints. They were bigger than any he had encountered, the impressions sharp and deliberate, as if the animal had walked with purpose. Tom adjusted his pack and kept moving, his senses on high alert. The first encounter came late that afternoon. Tom had just crossed a shallow stream when he spotted the bear. It was colossal, its hump towering over its massive shoulders, its fur a rich, mottled brown. The grizzly stood 50 yards away, staring at him with unsettling stillness. Tom froze. Every instinct screamed for him to slowly back away, avoiding eye contact. He followed the protocol, moving with deliberate caution, his hand hovering over the bear spray. But the bear didn't charge. It didn't retreat either. Instead, it began to circle him, its movements almost leisurely. It would disappear behind a thicket, only to reappear on the other side, closer now. At one point, it brushed past a tree just 10 feet away from him, its eyes locking with his for a chilling moment. Tom's heart thundered in his chest. This wasn't normal behavior. Grizzlies could be territorial, aggressive, or dismissive of humans, but this bear's actions felt calculated. It was sizing him up. Tom spent the next hour attempting to distance himself. He crossed streams, climbed ridges, and plunged into dense undergrowth while glancing over his shoulder. The bear followed. It didn't hurry, didn't hide. It simply shadowed him as if ensuring he couldn't forget its presence. By dusk, Tom found a rocky outcrop and decided to make camp. He hoped the elevation would deter the bear. Exhausted, he fortified his position as best he could, setting his bear spray within arm's reach and gripping his knife as darkness swallowed the land. Sleep was impossible. He heard the bear's heavy footfalls below at intervals, twigs snapping and leaves rustling. He could imagine its silhouette creeping out of sight, waiting for something he couldn't comprehend. Around midnight, new sounds joined the bear's movements, lighter, more erratic steps. He peered into the gloom and caught fleeting shapes in the moonlight. 2 smaller grizzlies had joined the first. Tom's blood turned to ice. This wasn't a chance encounter. This was something orchestrated. The next day, Tom pressed on, fighting the mounting fear that had taken root in his chest. The bears continued their haunting pursuit, their presence oppressive. Kodiak, as Tom later learned locals called the massive male, seemed to relish the torment. It would vanish for hours, only to return suddenly, closer than before. The smaller bears mimicked its behavior, darting into view and disappearing, their movements disjointed but purposeful. By mid-afternoon, Tom's nerves began to fray. He tried to calm himself, relying on logic and experience, but the situation defied explanation. Why hadn't they attacked? Was Kodiak toying with him, or was this some darker ritual of dominance? When the attack came, it was with terrifying precision. Tom had reached another ridge, thinking the bears had finally abandoned him. He was wrong. Kodiak emerged from the shadows first, its massive frame blocking his path. Behind it, the smaller bears flanked him, cutting off any retreat. The world seemed to hold its breath for a brief, agonizing moment. Then Kodiak surged forward. The grizzly's speed was a horrifying blur. Tom raised his bear spray, releasing a cloud of capsaicin that temporarily halted the charge, but Kodiak barely flinched. It swatted the canister aside with a massive paw. Tom screamed internally as the bear slammed into him, its sheer weight knocking him to the ground. His knife found purchase in Kodiak's flank, but it was a futile effort against the predator's fury. The smaller bears joined the fray, their claws raking his sides as he struggled to fight back. The attack was brutal and unrelenting. Tom's world dissolved into pain, blood, and the roars of his assailants. Kodiak's strikes were methodical, claws ripping through flesh with terrifying efficiency, yet it didn't deliver a killing blow. It seemed to relish his suffering, stepping back occasionally to observe the damage before lunging again. The smaller bears mirrored this behavior, their attacks punctuated by moments of eerie stillness. When the bears finally left, Tom was barely alive. They disappeared into the wilderness, leaving behind a man broken in body and spirit. Blood soaked the ground around him, and every breath was a struggle. He lay motionless for hours, gazing at the sky as the crushing weight of his fate bore down on him. His battered body left him immobilized, unable to call for help, and he remained that way until he drew his final agonizing breath. When a group of hikers eventually discovered him, his body was cold and stiff. They alerted the park rangers, who recovered his remains and identified him through the belongings in his bag. His family was notified, and he was later laid to rest in a quiet cemetery. The tragedy sent shockwaves through his community, leaving his loved ones and many others in deep mourning. Yet no amount of grief could undo what had been done or bring him back to life. The morning sun had barely crested over the ridges of a park in the United States of America, casting long shadows across the landscape as a group of 5 hikers made their way along a narrow, winding trail. The sky above was a bright blue, and the towering trees flanked the path, giving the illusion of safety in the wilderness. Among the group were Caleb, the most experienced of the hikers, his cousin Owen, friends Sawyer and Garrett, and Maya, an avid nature enthusiast eager to capture the perfect photograph of the wild beauty around them. The trail they had chosen was less popular, weaving through steep ridges with abrupt drop-offs that tumbled into rocky ravines below. The sense of adventure heightened as they ascended higher, the path narrowing with each step. Overhead, birds occasionally called, and in the distance, the faint rush of a river echoed through the still air. As they rounded a sharp bend in the trail, a sudden rustling sound echoed from the dense brush ahead. Caleb signaled the group to halt, his senses alert. In the silence that followed, the source of the sound became painfully clear. A grizzly bear cub, no older than a few months, emerged from the bushes on the trail ahead of them. The cub, curious and unaware of the group, paused to sniff the air, its small frame adorably clumsy, but a stark reminder that where there was a cub, a mother was indeed not far behind. The hikers froze, their eyes wide with apprehension. Caleb, his heart now pounding, gestured for the group to slowly back away. But before they could make any headway, a heavy grunt came from behind them, echoing up the trail. There, from the direction they had just come, a massive female grizzly bear emerged, her fur bristling and her dark eyes locking onto the hikers with deadly intent. She was much closer than the cub, and far more dangerous. The hikers now found themselves in an impossible situation. The mother grizzly stood behind them, her hulking figure blocking the only path down, while the cub was directly in front, its confused mewling drawing the mother closer. They were trapped, with cliffs dropping off on either side of the narrow trail and nowhere to flee without risking a fatal fall. The grizzly mother let out a deep, guttural growl, a clear sign of her growing agitation. She was torn between protecting her cub and eliminating what she saw as a threat. Her massive body shifted on the path, her claws scraping against the loose rock and dirt as she began to inch forward. The cub, hearing its mother, started to meander toward her, but the group stood in its way. Caleb motioned to retreat slowly, stepping backward inch by inch, but as the group complied, disaster struck. Garrett, who had been standing closest to the edge of the trail, placed his weight on a patch of loose rock. The ground beneath him gave way without warning, sending him tumbling toward the cliff edge. His arms flailed as he tried to catch himself, but the sudden movement startled the already tense grizzly. The mother bear charged. Her massive frame barreled forward with terrifying speed, closing the gap in mere seconds. Caleb's heart raced as he watched Garrett scramble to regain his footing. The sudden surge of movement from the bear sent loose rocks cascading down the cliffside, the sound of them crashing below adding to the chaos. The hikers were in a state of panic now, their retreat faltering. The mother grizzly's powerful strides brought her terrifyingly close, her teeth bared and eyes wild with fury. Maya stumbled backward, her camera clattering to the ground, forgotten in the sheer terror of the moment. Garrett managed to stop his fall just as the bear reached the group. Her massive paw swiped through the air, narrowly missing him but striking Owen, who had been closest to Garrett, in an attempt to help him. Owen crumpled to the ground, gasping as the bear's claws raked across his torso, leaving deep gashes that immediately began to bleed. Sawyer, in his desperation to avoid the bear's attack, made a break for the cliffside, misjudging the distance. His foot slipped on the crumbling rocks, and he went down hard, his body skidding dangerously close to the edge. The sharp stones beneath him tore through his clothes and skin, but the proximity to the sheer drop kept him frozen in place, unable to move without risking falling to his death. Caleb, paralyzed by the sight of his friend's injuries, struggled to think. The bear, now fully committed to defending her cub, reared up on her hind legs, standing over 7 feet tall. She let out a roar that echoed through the canyon, her massive bulk casting a long shadow over the crumpled hikers below her. As the bear came down on all fours again, her eyes flicked toward Garrett, who was still scrambling to find solid ground. The movement caught her attention, and she charged again, her claws digging deep into the earth. Garrett, realizing too late that he was her next target, barely managed to roll to the side as the grizzly lunged, but his movements caused the cliff edge to give way beneath him. His body plunged downward, arms grasping at air as he fell, disappearing from view as the group helplessly watched. Owen, gasping for breath through the pain, tried to crawl away, leaving a trail of blood in his wake. Caleb, now fully realizing the hopelessness of the situation, frantically searched for a way to get the group out of this nightmare. The cub had wandered off the trail, and the mother bear, still enraged, was pacing back and forth, growling menacingly, her eyes darting between the remaining hikers. Maya, shaking with fear, pulled herself up from the dirt, only to see that Sawyer had slid even closer to the cliff's edge. His fingers clawed at the loose ground, desperately trying to find purchase. Caleb moved toward him, hoping to pull him back to safety, but the bear caught sight of the movement. With a terrifying roar, she lunged again. Caleb's heart raced as the grizzly charged straight at him. He could feel the ground trembling beneath her weight as she closed the distance. Just as she was about to reach him, Maya threw herself in the opposite direction, hoping to distract the bear. The grizzly hesitated for a split second, her attention shifting between Caleb and Maya before she finally turned toward her cub, now out of sight down the trail. The bear, sensing that her cub had wandered away, gave one final growl before retreating down the trail, her massive body vanishing into the underbrush. The hikers, bruised, bleeding, and terrified, could only stare at each other in disbelief, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. Caleb looked down the cliff where Garrett had fallen, the silence below unbearable. The group, though alive, was shattered. Their bond tested in the most harrowing of circumstances. The wilderness had brutally reminded them that in Yellowstone, nature held the ultimate power. The sun rose over the zoo, casting long shadows across the enclosures. Frank Mulligan, a seasoned veteran of over 30 years, walked his familiar route one last time, filled with memories of the animals he had cared for. Today marked his retirement, a bittersweet milestone. Beside him was Sam, an enthusiastic rookie eager to learn the ropes. Sam's energy was infectious as he peppered Frank with questions about the animals and zoo operations. Frank, patient yet measured, offered advice, allowing Sam to observe and learn. Their dynamic was evident. Frank's cautious experience contrasted sharply with Sam's reckless enthusiasm. As they approached the brown bear enclosure, Frank's gaze fell on Kodiak, the zoo's largest bear, a hulking presence he had cared for since cubhood. Frank respected Kodiak's moods, always mindful of the bear's potential danger. Sam, however, had little direct interaction with Kodiak and was about to witness the bear management process for the first time. But as they neared the entrance, Frank noticed a maintenance panel ajar, its bolts loosened, likely overlooked by a careless worker. Unease gripped him as he realized the danger. This panel provided access to a service gate, the only barrier between Kodiak and freedom. In an instant, Kodiak sensed the opportunity. Frank's heart raced as he watched the bear grip the loose gate with its powerful paw and tug it open. Before either man could react, Kodiak slipped through, emerging into the zoo's public area. Panic erupted as the first visitors spotted the massive bear. Screams filled the air, and chaos ensued as people scattered in all directions, fleeing from the predator now roaming freely. Frank's heart pounded in his chest as he assessed the situation. This was no longer about preventing an escape. It was now a race to stop a catastrophe. Kodiak, disoriented by the sudden freedom, was unpredictable and dangerous. Frank knew what the bear was capable of, and with frightened visitors running chaotically, the potential for disaster was immense. Sam, his voice trembling, pointed to a tranquilizer gun mounted on a nearby wall. Frank shook his head, knowing it wasn't a quick fix. The tranquilizers would take too long to subdue an animal of Kodiak's size, and firing in a crowded area could only make the situation worse. This would have to be handled up close, carefully, and with precision. Frank's mind raced as he tried to formulate a plan. He knew Kodiak's habits. If they could guide him back toward the enclosure, they might have a chance. But Sam had other ideas. The rookie's impulse was to chase the bear, attempting to corner it using vehicles and barriers. Frank, though, knew that chasing Kodiak would only escalate the bear's aggression. As Sam darted off to execute his plan, Frank felt a surge of frustration. The young keeper's inexperience was driving him into dangerous decisions. Frank stayed back, using his knowledge of Kodiak to keep the bear in sight but at a safe distance, hoping to steer the massive creature without provoking a confrontation. However, Sam's risky approach quickly backfired. A group of zoo workers attempted to block Kodiak's path using a small utility vehicle. The bear, feeling trapped, reacted with terrifying speed. With a guttural roar, he charged the car, flipping it effortlessly. The workers fled, leaving the vehicle a crumpled heap. Kodiak, now agitated, reared up on his hind legs, towering over the scene, his claws slashing at the air. Frank knew they were losing control. Kodiak's aggression was escalating rapidly, and if they didn't intervene quickly, someone would be seriously hurt or worse. He abandoned his cautious distance and moved in closer, heart pounding, knowing this was a critical moment. Kodiak turned toward a cluster of fleeing visitors. Frank could see the fear in their faces, and his instincts took over. With no other options, he grabbed a metal rod from a nearby supply shed and waved it in the air, making himself as large and intimidating as possible. Kodiak's attention shifted, his beady eyes locking onto Frank. It was a calculated risk. Frank knew the bear recognized him, but no guarantee would stop an attack. For a moment, Kodiak hesitated. The bear, now only a few yards away, growled deeply, his massive paws leaving gouges in the earth as he tested Frank's resolve. The air between them was thick with tension, each second dragging on for what felt like an eternity. Frank stood his ground, unflinching as Kodiak sized him up. But the standoff couldn't last forever. Suddenly, Kodiak lunged forward, the ground shaking under his weight. Frank reacted, sidestepping the bear's charge just in time, the massive paw swiping inches from his body. The rod in Frank's hand was useless against the sheer power of the bear's movements. All he could do now was stay alive long enough for help to arrive. The bear wheeled around quicker than Frank had expected, and this time, there was no avoiding the collision. Kodiak struck with brutal force, sending Frank sprawling to the ground. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs, but Frank managed to roll out of the way as Kodiak's claws came down again, gouging the dirt where Frank had just been. Desperation surged through Frank. He couldn't outrun the bear, and he certainly couldn't overpower it. But he could still outthink it. He grabbed a nearby bucket of fish meant for the polar bears and hurled it toward Kodiak. The sudden smell of food caught the bear's attention, and for a moment, Kodiak was distracted. It was all Frank needed. With adrenaline surging through him, Frank scrambled to his feet and used the few precious seconds to lead Kodiak back toward the enclosure. The bear followed, now more interested in the fish than the chaos around him. Frank's heart raced as they neared the gate, the plan coming together. As Kodiak entered the enclosure, Frank slammed the gate shut behind him, securing the bolts in place. He leaned against the fence, gasping for breath, his body trembling from the exertion and fear. Fog thickly blanketed the Alaskan village, muting sound and blurring the landscape. This small indigenous settlement, once ruled by ice, faced change as warming temperatures melted the sea ice. Yet today, the villagers gathered for a seasonal celebration, a brief moment of joy amid survival challenges. Families mingled, children played, and elders reflected quietly. The scent of food filled the cold air, symbolizing unity and tradition as they came together to honor their heritage and support one another in the shifting Arctic environment. Unbeknownst to them, something far more dangerous than any blizzard lurked beyond the edge of the fog. The polar bear, driven south by starvation, wandered in an increasingly unfamiliar environment. The sea ice, once the foundation of its hunting grounds, was disappearing, forcing it into closer proximity to human settlements. This particular bear had been stalking the periphery of the village for days, gaunt and desperate, its immense body weakened by hunger. It had smelled the food, sensed the warmth of life, and instinctively followed the scent through the fog. The bear's body was an embodiment of power, but power was diminished by need. Once thick and white, its fur clung to a skeletal frame, ribs visible beneath the matted fur. Yellowed eyes, filled with hunger and desperation, scanned the village from the shadows. The fog concealed its approach, as silent as the snow underfoot. It moved with a terrifying grace, its massive paws padding lightly as it neared the heart of the village. Suddenly, there was a shift. The bear stepped into the open, emerging from the mist like a phantom. At first, no one noticed. The gathering continued as children laughed and adults chatted. But then a gasp cut through the fog, and eyes turned toward the pale, hulking figure standing at the edge of the gathering. For a brief, surreal moment, the village was frozen, locked in a collective state of disbelief. It wasn't unusual to see polar bears in the Arctic, but never this close, never like this. The bear moved. It charged without warning, driven by an instinctual hunger that overpowered all caution. Its speed was shocking, belying its size and weakened condition. In an instant, the peaceful gathering turned into chaos. Screams erupted as the massive predator barreled forward, its powerful limbs propelling it toward the nearest group of villagers. A child, no older than 6, was caught in the bear's path. The predator's jaws, lined with dagger-like teeth, clamped down on the child's small frame with a sickening crunch. Blood sprayed across the snow, staining the pure white landscape a gruesome red. The bear's attack was swift and ruthless. It flung the child's lifeless body aside as if it weighed nothing and moved on to the next victim. Panic spread through the crowd like wildfire. People scrambled in all directions, some toward their homes, others trying in vain to help those already in the bear's path. Elders, their movement slowed by age, became easy targets. One of the village elders, a respected woman known for her wisdom, was caught off guard as she tried to shield a younger family member. The bear's massive paw swiped across her body, claws raking through her flesh as if she were made of paper. She collapsed in a heap, her body twisted and broken, lifeblood soaking into the ground beneath her. Another villager, a man in his 30s, grabbed a shovel from a nearby stack of tools. His face was etched with fear and determination as he ran toward the bear, swinging the makeshift weapon with all his strength. The shovel connected with the bear's side, but the impact was nothing more than a glancing blow. Enraged, the bear turned on him, its maw open wide. The man barely had time to react before the bear's jaws closed around his leg. It pulled him down, ripping into his flesh with savage efficiency. His screams echoed in the air, cut short by the bear's relentless mauling. In just 2 minutes, the polar bear had already claimed multiple lives, and the carnage was far from over. It moved with terrifying speed from one target to the next, its primal instincts honed from a life of survival in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Even weakened by hunger, its sheer strength was overwhelming. The bear swiped at another villager, tearing through clothing and flesh as it sent the man flying backward, landing in a crumpled heap. A group of villagers, in a desperate bid to defend their community, gathered whatever they could find, shovels, hammers, even kitchen knives, and charged at the bear. Their fear was palpable, but so was their determination. The bear met them with equal ferocity. It reared up on its hind legs, towering over them, a giant of muscle and bone. One villager stabbed at its belly with a knife, but the blade barely penetrated the thick fur and skin. The bear roared in fury and brought its total weight down on him, crushing his body beneath its bulk. Those who remained tried to flee. Parents scooped up their children, running toward the safety of their homes, but the bear was relentless. It charged at another group, its jaws snapping at anything that moved. A young girl, separated from her family in the chaos, found herself in the bear's direct path. She tried to run, but the bear's claws caught her leg, dragging her down into the snow. Her cries were lost amidst the frenzy as the bear tore into her. As the attack raged on, the village's isolation became painfully evident. No emergency services were close enough to respond in time. The nearest outpost was hours away by helicopter, and even that would be delayed by the fog and weather conditions. The villagers were alone, left to face the beast with nothing but their own courage and meager tools. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Eventually, through a combination of sheer willpower and luck, the remaining villagers managed to drive the bear back. Several men, wielding axes and other tools, landed blows that slowed the bear down. Bloodied and exhausted, the bear finally retreated into the fog, limping and growling, but it had already left its mark on the village. The aftermath was harrowing. Bodies lay strewn across the snow, their blood staining the earth. The survivors, trembling and in shock, surveyed the carnage. 9 people had been killed, including children and elders, their lives snuffed out in the blink of an eye. The village, once a place of tight-knit community and tradition, was now a scene of unspeakable horror. The Anderson family had eagerly anticipated their mountain getaway, hoping to escape their hectic lives and reconnect with nature. John and Lisa, along with their children, Noah, 14, and Emily, 10, rented a secluded cabin deep in the wilderness. Nestled among towering pines and overlooking a pristine lake, it offered a perfect retreat. The remoteness provided a welcome change from city life. No cell service, no distractions, just the sounds of nature. The first few days unfolded beautifully. Long hikes, marshmallow roasting, and nights spent under a starlit sky. But on the third night, a strange stillness fell over the forest. John sensed something was off as they retreated into the cabin after an evening by the fire. The usual sounds of the woods faded, creating an unsettling silence. Though rustic, the cabin felt sturdy, constructed from thick logs and heavy beams, yet they hadn't fully prepared for the local black bears, notorious for scavenging human food. The park ranger had warned them, but John was confident they had secured their supplies. As the family settled into bed, a massive male bear began to circle the cabin, drawn in by the scent of their food. The faint scratching at the door went unnoticed until it intensified into a loud pounding. John jolted awake around midnight, initially dismissing it as a tree branch. But as the thuds grew louder, dread filled him. He jumped from the bed, heart racing, while Lisa stirred beside him, sensing his alarm. Cracking the door open, John was met with the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against wood and a massive shadow outside. The bear was at the front door, battering against it with powerful limbs. Panic surged as John realized they were trapped inside. The cabin was sturdy but not impenetrable. If the bear broke through, there would be no stopping it. He turned to Lisa, now fully awake, her eyes wide with fear. The kids were in the other room, vulnerable and unaware of the looming danger. Time was running out, and the bear was determined to get in. A loud crack echoed through the cabin as the doorframe splintered. The bear, driven by hunger and the scent of food, broke through with alarming speed. Its head and massive shoulders squeezed through the opening, and in the dim light of the cabin, its dark eyes gleamed with determination. John's instincts kicked in. He needed to reach the children. But the bear was now entirely inside the main room, and the lumbering animal blocked the hallway leading to the kids' bedroom. Lisa grabbed his arm, her face pale. He could feel her trembling. The bear began sniffing the air, drawn toward the kitchen where the family's food was stored. For a brief moment, it seemed to be the scent of food, which allowed John and Lisa time to think. But the car keys were in the kitchen, hanging on a hook just above the counter where they'd left a loaf of bread out earlier. Their only chance of escape was getting those keys and making it to the car, parked just outside. They were pinned. With the bear's bulk blocking the main room, John motioned for Lisa to stay put, as he frantically scanned the room for something, anything that could help them. His eyes landed on an old hunting rifle mounted on the wall. He darted across the room, but as he grabbed the gun, his stomach sank. No ammunition. The bear, having torn into a cabinet, sent pans crashing to the floor. It growled a low, deep sound that rattled the walls. Noah and Emily's room was on the opposite side of the cabin, and they were still trapped inside. John knew that if the bear became too aggressive, it could easily tear through the doors to reach them. He edged closer to the hallway, trying to remain out of the bear's line of sight. The animal was preoccupied with its focus on rummaging through the kitchen, but any sudden movement or sound could draw its attention. He made it halfway down the hall when the bear suddenly jerked its head up, its sharp ears picking up on the creaking of the floorboards. It sniffed the air again, turning toward the hallway. John froze, every muscle in his body tense. The bear moved slowly in his direction, its heavy steps echoing off the wooden floor. Lisa, still near the bedroom, looked on helplessly. The bear's massive body shifted its attention entirely toward John now. With no place to run, John backed toward the kids' room, hoping to shield them from the impending danger. In a split-second decision, John flung a chair across the room, hoping to divert the bear's attention. The chair crashed against the wall, causing the bear to snarl and charge toward the noise. It swiped at the air, its powerful claws tearing through the fabric of the furniture. In the chaos, John managed to reach Noah and Emily's room. He shoved the door open, pulling the kids from their beds. They were groggy, but quickly understood the severity of the situation. With the bear still distracted in the main room, John motioned for them to be silent. There was no time to think about a complete escape plan, only survival. Lisa, seizing the moment, grabbed the car keys while the bear tore through the remnants of the kitchen. With John leading the kids and Lisa trailing closely behind, they moved as quietly as possible through the back hallway toward the side door. Suddenly, the bear let out an ear-splitting roar. It had realized its human prey was trying to escape. It charged toward them, its claws scraping the floorboards, tearing through the house in a frantic rush. John shoved the side door open just in time. They all stumbled out into the cold night air, sprinting toward the car parked just a few feet away. The bear slammed into the door frame behind them, but by then, they were already inside the car. Lisa jammed the keys into the ignition, hands shaking uncontrollably as she started the engine. With a roar of the engine, they sped down the dirt road, leaving the cabin and the enraged bear behind in the darkness. As the cabin disappeared in the rearview mirror, they knew that they had narrowly escaped a brutal encounter, but the image of the bear breaking into their peaceful sanctuary would haunt them long after the mountain retreat was over. Dr. Elena Rossi stood at the edge of the dense spruce forest, her breath steady but her heart racing. As a wildlife biologist with over a decade of experience studying bears, she was well acquainted with the challenges of the wilderness. Today, however, was different. Reports of an orphaned bear cub wandering near her research station had reached her, and the urgency to act was palpable. If she didn't intervene quickly, the cub would face starvation or predators. Equipped with her tranquilizer rifle and her expertise, Elena set off, her boots crunching on the forest floor as she searched for any signs of the cub. This area was known territory for a local mother bear and her offspring, but there was no sign of them. Time was critical, and the cub was alone and vulnerable. As she navigated the underbrush, the forest hummed with life. Birds chirped overhead and leaves rustled in the breeze. Then, through a break in the trees, she spotted it. The small cub lay curled near a fallen tree, weak and exposed. Its coat, typically thick and glossy, was matted, and it barely lifted its head as she approached. Elena's heart ached. This was the moment she had trained for countless times, yet it never got easier. Slowly kneeling, she readied her tranquilizer gun, intent on sedating the cub and bringing it back for care. Her movements were calm and precise as she adjusted the dart for the cub's small size, but just as she was about to aim, a deep, guttural growl echoed through the clearing. Every instinct in her body screamed danger. Elena froze, her heart racing. The growl intensified, and her blood ran cold as she turned her head. Emerging from the underbrush was the mother bear, massive and imposing, her dark fur gleaming in the sunlight. The bear sniffed the air, her dark eyes locking onto Elena and the cub. Elena's mind raced. The mother had been out of sight, likely foraging or patrolling her territory. But now, she saw Elena as a threat to her young. In an instant, the bear lunged forward with a deafening roar that shook the forest. Elena dropped the tranquilizer gun and scrambled backward, adrenaline surging. She recognized this wasn't a warning, it was a full-blown attack. The bear believed her cub was in danger. With no time to think, Elena threw herself to the side, narrowly avoiding a massive paw that swiped where she had just been. The bear was relentless. Panic surged in her, but she had to stay focused. She needed to create distance. Darting toward a cluster of trees, she relied on her understanding of bear behavior to navigate the terrain. Bears, though bulky, could sprint with surprising speed. The ground shook as the bear charged after her, its fury palpable. Elena's legs burned as she ran, branches whipping against her face and arms. She ducked behind a tree, hoping to buy herself some time. The bear skidded to a halt, sniffing the air, clearly agitated. Elena's heart raced as she formulated a plan. She needed to reach her research station, where safety awaited. But with the bear in pursuit, she had to act quickly. But then she tripped. Her foot caught on a root, sending her sprawling to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of her, but there was no time to recover. The bear was upon her, and Elena barely rolled out of the way as the bear struck, her claws tearing into the ground where Elena had been. Elena gasped in pain as she felt the bear's claws rake across her leg. White-hot agony shot through her body. She bit back a scream, knowing that any noise might further provoke the bear. Blood soaked her pants, but she couldn't stop now. Every second counted. The bear, enraged, reared up on her hind legs, towering over Elena. For a split second, Elena stared up at the beast, knowing how close she was to death. She managed to scramble to her feet, clutching her bleeding leg. With every ounce of strength she had left, she stumbled toward the nearest large tree. She had to put something solid between her and the bear. She could feel the animal's hot breath on her back as she threw herself behind the tree trunk, just as the bear slammed into it with a thunderous roar. The impact shook the tree, but it held. For a moment, there was a brief respite. Elena clung to the trunk, gasping for air, blood still pouring from her leg. The bear circled the tree, growling, her claws scraping the bark. Elena knew this wasn't over. The bear was determined, and with no other prey in sight, she wasn't going to leave until Elena was dealt with. With no time to waste, Elena knew she had to retreat to the safety of her research station. Her supplies were limited, and the radio had been damaged in a storm the week before. But it was her only hope. She hobbled as fast as she could, moving through the forest, her vision blurring from the pain and the loss of blood. The bear followed relentlessly, crashing through the undergrowth with terrifying speed. Elena's mind raced. She had to think like a bear, use her knowledge to survive. She angled her path toward the steep ravine that bordered the station, knowing the bear wouldn't follow down such a hazardous drop. As she neared the edge, the sound of the bear's growls grew louder and closer. Finally, she reached the ravine, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She half slid, half fell down the steep incline, wincing as the jagged rocks tore at her skin. The bear stopped at the top, pacing back and forth, growling in frustration but unwilling to follow her down the treacherous path. Elena collapsed at the bottom, her body trembling from shock and exhaustion. She had made it, barely, but the bear wasn't leaving. She watched as it paced along the ridge, still furious, unwilling to abandon its cub, which it still thought was in danger. For hours, Elena remained trapped at the bottom of the ravine, too injured to move, with the bear still nearby. She needed to get back to the station, but with her radio damaged and limited supplies, her options were grim. Her only hope was to wait, to allow time for the bear to calm down, and then find a way to reunite the cub with its mother. Elena had always known the risks of working with wildlife, but now, bleeding and stranded in the wild, she had to use every bit of her knowledge to survive this ordeal. It was a battle between instinct and understanding, and Elena, in her weakened state, knew she was at the mercy of nature. The Wilson family had planned this camping trip in the Adirondacks for months. Mark and Sarah, along with their two young children, Emma and Jacob, had spent countless hours preparing, eager to escape the noise and rush of their suburban lives for a few days in the crisp, quiet wilderness. It was late October, and the Adirondacks were bathed in the golden hues of autumn, with leaves crunching underfoot and the scent of pine and earth thick in the air. For the children, this was an adventure. A weekend of campfires, marshmallows, and sleeping under the stars. Their campsite sat nestled among the towering trees, miles away from the nearest ranger station. The remoteness added to the allure, but it also meant they were on their own if anything went wrong. Still, Mark had always considered himself well-versed in camping. He was confident in their safety, especially after setting up their tent at a distance from where they'd store their food and cook their meals. They had read all the pamphlets about wildlife, and Mark had assured Sarah they'd be fine as long as they followed the rules about food storage. But the Adirondacks were home to creatures that operated under different rules, creatures driven by the unrelenting need to survive, especially as winter loomed. The black bears, normally elusive and uninterested in humans, were in a frenzy of feeding, fattening themselves up for hibernation. Even a whiff of poorly stored food could become an irresistible draw. That afternoon they thoroughly enjoyed themselves. The kids had run through the forest, climbing rocks and collecting leaves, their laughter echoing off the hills. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the air turned colder, Mark lit the campfire, and they roasted hot dogs and marshmallows. The children, exhausted but happy, curled up in their sleeping bags early. Mark and Sarah stayed by the fire a little longer, enjoying the peace that only the wilderness could provide. What Mark didn't realize, however, was that earlier in the day, when he hastily packed away the remnants of lunch, he had left traces of food near the tent, a smear of peanut butter here, a wrapper there. To him, it seemed insignificant, but to a bear preparing for hibernation, it was enough. The first sign of trouble came just after dusk. There was a rustling in the distance, a sound too large to be a raccoon or deer. Mark, standing at the edge of the firelight, peered into the darkness. It was probably nothing, he thought, though a chill of unease settled over him. He dismissed it, returning to the fire and stoking it higher, hoping to ward off the biting cold. Later, as the family settled into their tent for the night, a soft grunt echoed through the trees. It was low and distant, but unmistakable to anyone familiar with the Adirondacks. Sarah's hand tightened on Mark's arm. A black bear. Likely just passing through, he assured himself, though his mind raced. Black bears were generally timid, but it was late in the season, and this one might be more aggressive, desperate to find enough calories to survive the coming months. The snapping of twigs grew louder as the bear drew near to their camp. Mark, heart pounding, slipped on his boots and grabbed a flashlight. Bears were usually scared off by noise or bright lights, but as he stepped outside the tent and shone the beam into the dark forest, he saw nothing. The silence was unnerving, but Mark knew the bear was close. It had picked up the scent of their food. Hidden in the shadows, the bear, a large male over 300 pounds, circled the campsite with eerie stealth. It had already begun to lose its natural caution, drawn by the promise of an easy meal. Suddenly there was a loud crash. The bear had found the food storage, knocking over the cooler. Mark cursed under his breath. Grabbing the air horn from the emergency kit, he blasted it into the night. The bear hesitated briefly, its ears flicking in irritation, but it didn't leave. It was hungry, and fear had given way to determination. The bear loomed just beyond the firelight, a massive dark figure barely visible against the trees. Inside the tent, Sarah clutched their children, Emma and Jacob, trying to calm them while her panic surged. She could hear the bear pawing at their supplies. Mark hurled rocks at the beast, hoping to drive it off, but the bear was undeterred. Its patience was growing thin, and Mark realized the real danger wasn't just in the food. It was in the bear's persistence. Hours passed in tense silence as the bear stalked the campsite, returning after every scare tactic. Mark kept the fire high, praying it would be enough to keep the bear at bay. At one point, the bear brushed against the tent, its massive body pressing against the thin fabric. Inside, Sarah could hear its heavy breathing, just inches from her children. As the night dragged on, Mark's mind raced. Could they run to the car? No, it was too risky. They were miles from help, and escape in the dark was impossible. Their only option was to wait for the morning, hoping the bear would finally retreat. Just as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, a sharp snap echoed through the woods. The bear, startled by the awakening forest, finally turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving the family shaken but alive. The Appalachian Mountains stretched endlessly with their dense, rugged forests. As dawn broke, Jack moved silently through the underbrush, his boots barely making a sound on the damp earth. The sun's early rays cast long shadows, and the forest stirred with the soft rustling of waking wildlife. Having hunted these woods for over 2 decades, Jack knew the terrain intimately. His goal today was a mature buck he'd been tracking for days based on fresh tracks he'd seen by the creek. Every step Jack took was precise and measured, reflecting his deep familiarity with the wilderness. The forest, thick with towering oaks and maples, created a canopy of green and gold, filtering sunlight into a dotted pattern. Jack's rifle was slung over his shoulder, and his camouflage attire blended seamlessly with the surroundings. His breath was steady, his heartbeat slow. He was entirely in his element. As Jack followed the fresher tracks more profoundly into the woods, he noticed broken twigs, stray hairs, and faint hoof impressions. His pulse quickened with excitement. The forest grew denser, the scent of earth and decaying leaves filled the air, and the distant sound of running water reached him. Then he spotted new tracks, larger, deeper, and indicative of a bear. Jack crouched to inspect them, noting their fresh appearance and wandering pattern. Black bears roamed these woods, though encounters were rare. His attention shifted from the deer to the bear as a sudden rustle in the bushes made him freeze. Jack readied his rifle and moved cautiously, his eyes scanning the dense foliage. Through a break in the trees, he spotted the bear about 30 yards away, its massive form partially obscured by bushes. The bear was foraging, its snout buried in the undergrowth. Jack marveled at the sight, but remained alert. Just as he decided to retreat, his foot slipped on a loose stone, creating a sharp noise. The bear's head snapped up, its eyes locking onto Jack. A tense standoff ensued, with Jack hoping the bear would lose interest. However, the bear's nostrils flared, detecting Jack's scent. Its body tensed, muscles rippling, and Jack knew the situation had changed. Bears are unpredictable. Their behavior is governed by instinct and circumstance. Jack understood this all too well, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. The bear, perhaps perceiving Jack as a threat to its food, let out a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the trees. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as the bear took a step toward him, its posture suddenly aggressive. He knew he had to act fast. Without thinking, Jack began to slowly back away, his rifle now raised slightly, ready to fire if necessary. He didn't want to shoot the bear. It wasn't necessary. If he could create enough distance, the bear might decide he wasn't worth the trouble. But the bear had other ideas. It took another step forward, then another, its growl deepening into a roar that sent birds scattering from the treetops. And then, in an instant, the bear charged. The speed of the attack was startling. One moment, the bear was several yards away. The next, it was thundering toward him, a blur of black fur and fury. Jack barely had time to react. He aimed his rifle, but the bear was too fast. It was on him before he could pull the trigger. The impact was like being hit by a freight train. The force of the bear's charge knocked Jack off his feet, sending him crashing to the ground with a bone-jarring thud. His rifle was torn from his hands, skidding across the dirt out of reach. The bear was on top of him, its powerful claws digging into his flesh, its teeth snapping inches from his face. The world became a blur of pain and chaos as Jack fought to free himself from the bear's relentless assault. Jack's survival instincts kicked in. He twisted and turned, using every ounce of strength he had to fend off the bear's attacks. But the bear was an unstoppable force, its claws ripping through his jacket, tearing into the skin beneath. Jack's vision blurred with the pain, but he forced himself to focus, to think. He knew that if he didn't find a way to escape, the bear would kill him. Somehow, in the chaos, Jack managed to roll onto his side, his hands scrabbling in the dirt for something, anything, that he could use to defend himself. His fingers brushed against a rock, smooth and cool under his touch. Without hesitation, he grabbed it, swinging it with all his might at the bear's head. The rock connected with a sickening thud, and for a split second the bear recoiled, stunned. It was the opening Jack needed. Ignoring the searing pain in his shoulder, he scrambled to his feet, lunging for his rifle, which lay a few feet away. But the bear recovered quickly. It roared in anger, its eyes wild with fury, and charged again. Jack could feel its hot breath on the back of his neck as he reached for his weapon, his fingers closing around the stock just as the bear's claws raked down his back. He fell to the ground, the rifle in his hands, and rolled onto his back, bringing the weapon up just as the bear lunged at him. There was no time to aim, no time to think. Jack squeezed the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the forest, a loud crack that seemed to hang in the air. The bear flinched, a look of shock in its eyes as the bullet grazed its shoulder. It wasn't a fatal shot, but it was enough to make the bear hesitate, enough to break the momentum of its attack. For a moment, the bear and Jack stared at each other, both panting heavily, both bloodied and exhausted. Then, slowly, the bear began to retreat. It backed away, its eyes never leaving Jack, as if weighing whether to continue the attack. But finally, with a snort of frustration, it turned and lumbered off into the woods, disappearing into the underbrush as quickly as it had appeared. Jack lay on the ground, his chest heaving with each ragged breath. Pain radiated from every part of his body, but he was alive. He had survived. He knew he had to move to get out of the forest and find help before his injuries overwhelmed him. But for a few moments he just lay there, staring up at the canopy of trees above, his mind reeling from the ordeal. The cold dawn light filtered through the tall pines of Banff National Park, casting long shadows over the dense underbrush. The crisp air carried the fresh scent of pine needles and the lingering chill of the night. Levi and Arnold, part of a small group of campers, had risen early, eager for a day of hiking in the Canadian Rockies. After arriving at their campsite the previous evening and enjoying a night of laughter around the fire, they had retired to their tents, lulled by the wilderness sounds. The campsite, nestled in a valley surrounded by towering peaks, offered stunning views and easy access to popular trails. It was a serene spot that promised adventure and a break from daily life. As the sun rose, the campsite was peaceful, with only the rustling of leaves and occasional bird calls breaking the silence. The campers, still groggy, prepared breakfast and discussed their plans for the day. The aroma of coffee and frying bacon mingled with the earthy scent of the forest, creating a tranquil morning. However, amid this calm, a mistake had been made. In their excitement, the group had neglected food storage guidelines. A half-eaten sandwich and snacks were left on a picnic table. They had planned to address it in the morning, but they did not fully grasp the potential consequences of their oversight. The scent of the food drifted through the forest, attracting a grizzly bear, a powerful predator roaming Banff National Park. This grizzly, with a thick brown coat and rippling muscles, was drawn by the promise of an easy meal. Experienced in scavenging human campsites, it was quick to seize opportunities. In the early morning hours, while the campers were still asleep, the grizzly approached the campsite. Moving silently through the forest, the bear's heightened senses guided it toward the source of the enticing aroma. As it emerged from the trees and approached the campsite, its eyes fixed on the unattended food, a primal response ignited. The bear's pace quickened as it crossed the open ground, its breath visible in the cool air. The campers, focused on their morning routines, remained unaware of the approaching danger. It wasn't until one of them stepped out of his tent and spotted the bear that fear jolted through the group. Levi, who the fire pit had crouched, looked up just in time to see the grizzly bear emerge fully into the clearing. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment he was frozen in place, his mind struggling to process the sight before him. The bear was immense, its size even more imposing up close, and its presence was utterly terrifying. The animal's eyes gleamed with a mix of curiosity and hunger as it sniffed the air, its gaze locking onto the unattended food on the table. Panic began to ripple through the group as the campers realized the gravity of the situation. Arnold, who had been gathering firewood a short distance away, dropped his bundle and rushed back toward the others. He too felt the cold grip of fear as he saw the bear advancing on their campsite. The grizzly, sensing the rising tension, paused for a moment, its ears twitching as it gauged the human's reactions. Levi and Arnold exchanged a glance, their unspoken understanding clear. They needed to scare the bear away. It was a desperate plan, born of the instinct to protect their friends and themselves, but it was also one fraught with danger. They knew the risks of confronting a grizzly, especially one that had already identified a food source. Yet the alternative, doing nothing and allowing the bear to rummage through their campsite, seemed just as dangerous. Levi, summoning all the courage he could muster, grabbed a large branch from the ground. He knew that bears could be intimidated by loud noises and aggressive posturing, but he also knew that it was far from a guaranteed deterrent. Arnold, following Levi's lead, picked up a metal pot and began banging it loudly, hoping to startle the bear into retreat. The grizzly, however, was not easily intimidated. It had encountered humans before and was familiar with their attempts to scare it off. Instead of retreating, the bear let out a deep, resonant growl, a sound that reverberated through the campsite like a thunderclap. The campers froze, their makeshift weapons suddenly feeling woefully inadequate in the face of such raw power. Without warning, the bear charged. The grizzly closed the gap with terrifying speed. Levi, standing closest, barely had time to react before the bear was on him. He swung a branch in a desperate defense, but the bear effortlessly batted it away. The force sent Levi crashing to the ground, pain searing through his chest as the bear's claws raked across him. His vision darkened as the bear loomed overhead. Arnold, seeing Levi's peril, rushed to help, wielding a metal pot. But the bear, fully committed, turned on Arnold with lightning speed. It bit down on his arm, the pain excruciating and fiery. The bear shook Arnold violently, dragging him to the ground. Despite Arnold's desperate kicks and strikes, the bear's immense strength overpowered him. Levi, though badly injured, pushed himself to his knees, his vision blurred. He grabbed a rock and hurled it at the bear. The rock struck the grizzly's face, causing it to release Arnold momentarily. The brief distraction gave Arnold a chance to scramble away, clutching his wounded arm to his chest. Blood oozed from the deep gashes where the bear's teeth had sunk into his flesh, and he could feel the strength draining from his body with each passing second. But the instinct to survive was strong, and he forced himself to keep moving, knowing that to stop would mean certain death. The campers initially panicked, but they regrouped and tried to drive the bear away with noise. They grabbed sticks, rocks, and metal objects, creating a desperate symphony of survival. The grizzly hesitated, disoriented by the commotion. After a bone-chilling roar, it turned and lumbered back into the forest. In the aftermath, Levi lay on the ground, bloodied and gasping, while Arnold, barely conscious, was cradled with a makeshift tourniquet. Shock and horror were evident on the campers' faces. Despite their severe injuries, Levi and Arnold were still alive. The group quickly contacted park rangers and emergency services, who responded swiftly. Within an hour, a helicopter arrived, airlifting Levi and Arnold to the nearest hospital. Tom Sweeney, an avid fisherman, cherished the solitude of Alaska's rivers, where the natural world provided a perfect escape from modern chaos. In late August, during the peak of the salmon run, he had found a secluded spot along a remote riverbank. The river was alive with salmon fighting upstream, and Tom, in his well-worn waders, was immersed in the tranquil rhythm of fishing. The scent of pine and the soft blue sky made for a serene setting. Tom had risen early to secure this prime location. Each cast of his fly rod was precise, and soon he had hooked his first fish of the day. Hours passed in peaceful solitude as the sun rose higher and his creel filled with glistening salmon. Unbeknownst to Tom, a large grizzly bear had been silently observing him. Drawn by the scent of the fish, the powerful apex predator moved stealthily through the forest. Its deep brown fur and muscular frame were almost invisible against the underbrush, and the unfamiliar scent of a human piqued its curiosity. The bear kept its distance at first, evaluating the situation. It was accustomed to catching salmon, but was intrigued by the easy meal that the human seemed to be enjoying. With each step, the bear moved closer to the riverbank, its eyes fixed on Tom with predatory intent. Tom remained oblivious to the danger. Focused on landing a huge salmon, he didn't notice the bear's approach. The river's roar masked the bear's movement, and the grizzly was now just yards away, preparing to strike. Tom's attention was entirely on the fish, unaware of the massive shadow looming behind him. The attack was sudden and violent. The bear charged with astonishing speed, its massive body hurtling through the brush and onto the riverbank. The ground shook beneath its weight as it thundered forward, closing the distance in mere seconds. Tom barely had time to register the blur of motion before the bear was upon him, knocking him off his feet with a force that sent him crashing into the icy waters of the river. Disoriented and shocked, Tom struggled to regain his footing as the cold water closed around him. The world spun in a chaotic swirl of noise and pain, the river rushing in his ears as he tried to comprehend what had just happened. His fishing rod slipped from his grasp, the line trailing uselessly in the current as he flailed, trying to find some purchase on the slick riverbed. But the bear was relentless, its massive paws swiping at him with deadly precision. Tom's survival instincts kicked in. He knew that to survive a grizzly bear attack, one had to fight back to make oneself appear as large and threatening as possible. But in the water, disoriented and panicked, such logic was hard to grasp. He reached for his knife, fumbling with numb fingers as the bear's claws raked across his back, tearing through the thick fabric of his jacket. The pain was excruciating, a white-hot fire that seared through his nerves and sent shockwaves of terror coursing through his body. Finally, he managed to free the knife from its sheath, gripping it tightly as he tried to turn and face his attacker. The bear loomed over him, its maw open wide to reveal rows of sharp teeth, its breath hot and rank against his face. Tom slashed at the bear with all the strength he could muster, the blade finding its mark in the thick fur, but the bear was unfazed, its primal rage overriding any sense of pain or injury. With a powerful swipe of its paw, the bear knocked the knife from Tom's hand, sending it spinning into the river. Tom was defenseless now, reduced to little more than helpless prey in the face of the bear's fury. He struggled to escape, kicking and thrashing in the water, but the bear was too strong, too determined. It reared back on its hind legs before coming down with crushing force, its jaws closing around Tom's neck in a death grip. The world around Tom seemed to slow to a crawl, the sounds of the river fading into a distant hum. His vision darkened, the edges of his consciousness slipping away as the bear's teeth sank deeper into his flesh. There was no escaping the inevitable now, no hope of rescue or salvation. The bear's primal strength overwhelmed him completely, its massive body pinning him to the riverbed as it delivered the fatal bite. Tom's body went limp. The fight drained from him as life ebbed away. The bear, satisfied with its kill, dragged his lifeless form from the river and into the forest. The once peaceful riverbank was now a scene of violence and death, the water stained with Tom's blood as it rushed downstream. The bear, driven by its hunger, tore into Tom's flesh, feeding on the body with a savage intensity that only the wilderness could foster. Hours passed, and the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the river. The bear, having satisfied its hunger, left the remains of Tom's body deep within the forest, hidden from sight. The wilderness reclaimed the scene, the sounds of the river and the wind through the trees, returning to their natural rhythm. But the violence of the attack lingered, a stark reminder of the brutal reality that lurked beneath the surface of Alaska's pristine beauty. When Tom Sweeney failed to return as expected, his family grew alarmed. Known for his punctuality and routine, Tom's disappearance was out of character. As hours passed and night fell, anxiety turned into fear. By morning, they reported him missing, triggering a search and rescue operation in the remote wilderness where he had last been seen. Search teams scoured the dense forest and rugged terrain, with helicopters overhead and search dogs on the ground. Despite their efforts, days passed with no sign of Tom, dimming hopes of finding him alive. The breakthrough came at the riverbank, where they discovered bloodstains, torn clothing, and grizzly bear tracks. Following the trail into the forest, they found Tom's remains. The evidence of the bear's brutal attack was clear, leaving behind a scene of devastation. The news of Tom's death shocked his family and community. A cherished figure, Tom's loss was profound and served as a stark reminder of the dangers of Alaska's wild landscape, where the beauty of nature is coupled with its inherent risks. Night in a wilderness park in Montana's Rocky Mountains was crisp and clear, the vast expanse of stars glittering like scattered jewels above the Johanssons' campsite. The family of four had settled into their wilderness routine, savoring the calm after an invigorating day of hiking. The soft crackle of their campfire mingled with the occasional chirp of crickets, creating a symphony of serenity. The air carried the distinct blend of campfire smoke and roasted marshmallows as Eric Johansson, a sturdy man in his late 40s, tended the flames. His wife, Karen, and their two children, Clara and Ben, sat nearby, laughing as they competed to craft the perfect golden marshmallow. At first, the bear was just a shadow, a dark, lumbering figure emerging from the edge of the forest. Eric noticed it before anyone else. His easy smile vanished as he gestured silently for his family to stop talking. The black bear, though not as fearsome as a grizzly, was still a powerful presence, its size alone enough to command caution. It hesitated just beyond the campsite, sniffing the air with deliberate intent, drawn to the tempting aroma of their food. The firelight caught the gleam of its eyes as it took a step closer. Eric rose slowly, every muscle in his body tensed. He had read about encounters like this and knew that more often than not, bears could be frightened away without incident. Still, the sight of the animal filled him with a primal unease. He waved his arms and shouted, clapping his hands to appear larger and more threatening. Karen, her voice trembling, joined in, urging Clara and Ben to move toward the car parked a short distance away. But the bear didn't back down. Its ears flattened against its head, and it lowered its massive body into a posture Eric recognized immediately as aggression. His heart pounded as he grabbed a metal pan from the camp table, banging it loudly. The sharp clanging echoed through the still night, but the bear only grew more agitated. A low growl rumbled from its throat as it advanced another step. Then it charged. The bear crossed the campsite with shocking speed, its earlier lumbering pace replaced by an explosion of raw power. Eric barely had time to react before the animal slammed into him, knocking him to the ground with its immense weight. "Run!" he shouted, his voice raw with urgency. Karen grabbed the children and bolted for the car, their screams cutting through the night. The bear wasted no time. Its claws raked across Eric's shoulder in a brutal swipe. The thick fabric of his jacket shredded like paper, and hot pain flared as its claws sank into his flesh. Adrenaline coursed through him, dulling the agony enough to let him kick out at the bear, but its sheer mass pinned him down. When the bear's jaws clamped onto his arm, the sickening crunch of bone was drowned out by its feral snarls. The pain was overwhelming, but Eric's survival instincts kicked in. His free hand groped blindly until his fingers found the metal pan he'd dropped. With every ounce of strength he had, he swung it at the bear's head. The blow landed with a dull clang, causing the bear to recoil momentarily. Eric used the brief reprieve to struggle, but the strike seemed only to enrage the animal further. It roared, a sound that reverberated through the forest and charged at him again with renewed ferocity. Its claws tore into his torso, the thick fabric of his shirt offering no resistance. Deep, jagged gashes left his skin exposed to the freezing night air, and blood soaked the ground beneath him. The pain was relentless, but Eric refused to give in. He twisted and struggled, each movement sending fresh waves of agony through his body. The bear shifted its weight, its jaws finding his thigh. Eric screamed, the sound raw and guttural as the animal's teeth sank into muscle and bone. His vision blurred, and his strength ebbed with every passing second. The campsite, once filled with laughter and light, was now a scene of chaos. Blood stained the snow-dusted ground, steaming in the cold air. The fire flickered on, indifferent to the violence, casting eerie shadows on the carnage. Eric's breaths grew labored, his body weakening under the relentless assault. Every instinct told him to keep fighting, but his limbs felt leaden, the life draining out of him. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the attack stopped. The bear paused, its growls subsiding into deep, heavy breaths. It stood over Eric's broken body, sniffing the air as though deciding whether to continue. Eric lay still, his vision narrowing, his consciousness slipping away. Finally, with a huff, the bear turned and lumbered back into the forest, disappearing into the darkness as silently as it had arrived. The campsite was left in ruins, a stark tableau of survival and loss. Eric's blood stained the ground, mingling with the scattered remains of their belongings. The faint sweetness of roasted marshmallows lingered in the air, a haunting contrast to the scene of devastation. Hours later, the distant growl of an engine broke the stillness. Park rangers, alerted by Karen's frantic call, arrived to find Eric near the extinguished fire. His body, broken and bloodied, was surrounded by claw marks and the wreckage of the campsite. The bear was long gone, its trail vanishing into the wilderness it called home. Eric was rushed to the nearest hospital where doctors fought to stabilize him. Though his body bore the brutal marks of the attack, he survived, scarred but alive. For the Johansons, the events of that night would never fade. Karen and the children carried the weight of their helplessness and the image of Eric's selfless courage. The wilderness, once a source of joy and wonder, had become a place marked by tragedy. Eric's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of nature's unforgiving power. Yet, even as he healed, he found himself drawn to the wild. The scars on his body were not just reminders of pain, but symbols of his resolve to protect his family, even in the face of overwhelming danger. Canadian Rockies were alive with the raw, untamed beauty that had drawn Paul Lafleur back time and time again. A seasoned wildlife photographer, Paul thrived in solitude, where the distractions of human life gave way to the primal rhythms of nature. His battered hiking boots crunched through the frost-dusted forest floor as he ventured deeper into the wilderness, his camera equipment weighing heavily on his back. The air was crisp and sharp, carrying the faint musk of pine and damp earth. Paul had been tracking signs for hours. Scattered berry bushes stripped clean, claw marks etched into tree trunks, and patches of flattened grass whispered of a grizzly bear's passage, evidence of a creature that roamed the land with both grace and dominance. It was late autumn, and the bears were in a feeding frenzy before their long hibernation. Paul knew the risks, but had always trusted his instincts and knowledge of bear behavior. By mid-afternoon, he spotted it. A massive, majestic grizzly lumbered through a clearing below. From his perch on a rocky outcrop, Paul watched in awe as the bear foraged, its powerful paws overturning stones in search of insects. Its fur shimmered in the slanted sunlight, a golden brown that blended seamlessly with the surrounding landscape. Paul's fingers worked instinctively, adjusting the lens of his camera and firing off shots. Each click of the shutter felt like a small triumph, capturing moments of wild perfection. Minutes turned into an hour as Paul crouched there, his focus entirely on the bear. He watched it move with deliberate purpose, each action a testament to the raw efficiency of nature. Lost in his craft, he failed to notice when the bear lifted its head, sniffing the air. Its gaze shifted upward, dark eyes locking onto his distant silhouette. A brief pause. Then, without warning, the bear began to move toward him, each step deliberate and unnervingly fast. Paul froze, a cold spike of fear rooting him in place. The bear's gait shifted from a walk to a charge, and instinct took over. He abandoned his camera and sprinted toward the nearest tree, adrenaline surging through his veins and amplifying his every movement. The forest seemed to close in around him, the sound of snapping branches and his ragged breathing filling the air. Reaching a tall pine, Paul leaped at the trunk, his hands scrabbling for a grip on the rough bark. His boots slipped against the damp wood as he pulled himself upward, desperate to gain height before the bear reached him. The tree swayed under his weight, its branches thin and brittle at higher elevations. Below, the grizzly reached the base, slamming into the trunk with a force that made the entire tree shudder. The bear rose onto its hind legs, swiping at the trunk with claws that carved deep gouges into the bark. Paul clung to a branch, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. He had heard stories of bears climbing trees, but had convinced himself it was rare, that most wouldn't bother. Yet this bear was undeterred. It attacked the tree with relentless fury, shaking it violently as if testing Paul's resolve. Then it began to climb. Paul's breath caught as he watched the bear's claws sink into the bark, its immense body following upward. Panic surged through him as he scrambled higher, the branches beneath him bending dangerously. He tried to calculate his next move, but there was no escape. The bear closed the distance with terrifying ease, its eyes fixed on him like a predator with no intention of relenting. A branch cracked beneath Paul's foot, and he slipped, his body lurching downward before he caught himself on another branch. The momentary stumble cost him dearly. The bear surged upward, swiping at him with a paw that struck his leg. Pain shot through him as the claws tore through his flesh, shredding his pants and leaving deep gashes that oozed blood. He cried out, his grip weakening as the bear's other paw swiped again, this time catching his torso. The force of the blow knocked him loose. Paul fell, branches snapping and scraping against his body as he plummeted to the ground. He landed with a sickening thud, the air knocked from his lungs and pain radiating through every inch of him. He tried to move, but his body refused to respond. Before he could even think of crawling away, the bear was upon him. The first bite came with crushing force, the bear's jaws clamping onto his shoulder and shaking him like a rag doll. Paul's scream was guttural, torn from deep within him as the bear's teeth sank deeper. Blood poured from the wound, pooling on the forest floor as the bear released him, only to strike again. Its claws tore into his chest, shredding muscle and bone with horrifying efficiency. Paul's vision blurred, the world around him dissolving into a haze of pain and terror. He tried to fight back, his hands weakly pushing against the bear's massive head, but it was like trying to stop a freight train with a whisper. The bear's growls were deafening, a primal sound that drowned out everything else. Each attack was a calculated display of power, a reminder of the predator's dominance over its domain. The mauling felt endless, but eventually the bear stopped. It stood over Paul's broken body, sniffing him as if to confirm he was no longer a threat. Then, as suddenly as it had charged, it turned and lumbered back into the forest, its massive frame disappearing into the shadows. The clearing fell silent again. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the distant cry of a raven. Paul lay motionless, his body unrecognizable, his life extinguished in the very wilderness he had devoted himself to documenting. Days later, another photographer would find him, his camera lying a few feet away, still intact. The memory card, miraculously untouched, held the final images he had taken. A grizzly bear in all its majestic glory, unaware or perhaps unconcerned that it had become both subject and executioner. The discovery of Paul's remains sent shockwaves through the wildlife community. His death became a rallying cry for stricter safety protocols and renewed debates about the ethics of solo ventures into predator territory. Paul Lafleur had lived for the wild, capturing its beauty and power in ways few others could, but in the end the wilderness he revered had claimed him, a stark reminder of its unforgiving nature. The Siberian taiga was vast and silent, its endless expanse of snow-covered forest broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the pines. Sergei Volkov, a seasoned hunter, moved with practiced ease through the desolate wilderness. Years of experience had taught him to read the land as one would a book. The faint prints of an elk in the snow, the nibbled branches of a shrub, the distant crack of a twig. It was a brutal landscape, unforgiving to the careless, but Sergei knew its rhythms, its dangers, and its rewards. By mid-afternoon, he had achieved his goal. A large elk lay sprawled in the snow, its lifeless eyes reflecting the cold gray sky. Sergei stood over it, breathing heavily from the effort of the hunt. His rifle was slung over his shoulder, its barrel still warm from the shot that had brought the animal down. He began the laborious process of field dressing the elk, his knife slicing through sinew and muscle, steam rising from the carcass as the frigid air met warm flesh. The scent of blood was thick, clinging to him and saturating the clearing. It was then that Sergei noticed the tracks. At first, he thought they were old, faint impressions in the snow, barely visible in the fading light. But as he studied them more closely, his stomach tightened. The tracks were fresh, large, and unmistakably those of a bear. The realization hit him like a blow. The predator had been nearby, perhaps even watching, drawn by the scent of the kill. Sergei knew the risks. Bears, especially in the late stages of autumn before hibernation, were desperate and unpredictable. A fresh carcass was an irresistible lure, and any animal willing to claim it would not tolerate competition. He quickly packed what he could of the elk, slinging a heavy bundle of meat over his back. He didn't want to linger. The bear's tracks led in the direction he needed to go, forcing him to adjust his route. He decided to climb a ridge to gain both elevation and visibility, hoping to avoid an encounter. The climb was grueling. The snow was deep, and the weight of the elk meat pulled at his shoulders, slowing his pace. The forest around him grew darker as the sun sank lower, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and writhe with every gust of wind. Sergei's senses were on high alert, his ears straining for any sound beyond the crunch of his boots in the snow. The tracks had disappeared, but he knew better than to assume the bear had moved on. As he neared the top of the ridge, a sudden low growl froze him in place. The sound was deep and guttural, vibrating through the air like a warning. Sergei turned slowly, his breath visible in the cold as he scanned the forest behind him. There it was, a massive brown bear, its silhouette emerging from the shadows like a nightmare given form. Its eyes were fixed on him, black and unwavering, and its body tensed as it prepared to charge. Sergei unslung his rifle in a practiced motion, bringing the weapon to his shoulder as the bear charged. He fired, the crack of the shot echoing through the trees. The bullet struck the bear in its shoulder, staggering it, but the animal didn't stop. If anything, the pain seemed to enrage it further. Sergei quickly chambered another round and fired again, but the uneven terrain and the bear's speed threw off his aim. The second shot grazed its flank, drawing blood but doing little to slow its advance. The bear reached him in seconds. Its massive paw struck him with the force of a freight train, sending him sprawling into the snow. Pain exploded in his chest as claws tore through his coat and into his flesh, raking deep gashes across his torso. Sergei struggled to bring the rifle around, but the bear was relentless. It batted the weapon aside with such force that the stock snapped, leaving him defenseless. Pinned beneath the bear's weight, Sergei fought with a desperation born of sheer survival instinct. His knife was still on his belt, and he managed to pull it free, plunging the blade into the bear's side. The animal roared in fury, its breath hot and foul as it reared back, swiping at Sergei's face with its claws. The blow caught him across the head, splitting his scalp and filling his vision with blood and darkness. The bear bit down on Sergei's shoulder, its mighty jaws crunching through bone. He screamed, the sound muffled by the snow as the bear shook him like a rag doll. His arms flailed weakly, the knife slipping from his grasp as his strength began to fade. The bear's claws raked across his abdomen, tearing through muscle and spilling his insides onto the frozen ground. The snow beneath him turned red, the warmth of his blood melting the icy crust. As the attack continued, Sergei's body went limp. He remained conscious but was fading fast, his vision narrowing to a tunnel as shock set in. The bear seemed to sense his dwindling resistance, its savage mauling slowing as it sniffed at the remnants of its foe. Satisfied, it finally stepped back, its hulking form silhouetted against the darkening sky. With a final grunt, the bear turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving Sergei alone in the snow. Days later, the search party found what was left of him. His body lay near the carcass of an elk, mutilated and partially buried under a light dusting of snow. The signs of the struggle were evident: blood-streaked snow, broken branches, and deep gouges in the earth. A few feet away, the rifle lay shattered, its barrel bent and rendered useless. The bear was tracked and euthanized shortly after. Wildlife officials determined that it had been injured but not fatally wounded by Sergei's shots. Its aggression was likely exacerbated by hunger and the scent of the elk. The tragedy sent ripples through the hunting community, a grim reminder of the unforgiving nature of the Siberian wilderness. Sergei Volkov lived for the hunt, mastering tracking and survival in one of Earth's harshest environments. Ultimately, the wilderness he revered claimed him, blurring the line between predator and prey. His death stands as a cautionary tale about the fragile balance between human ambition and nature's raw power. In the whispers of the wind and the crunch of snow, his story lingers, a reminder that even skilled hunters are not invincible. The wilderness, beautiful yet brutal, demands respect and humility, teaching that survival is never guaranteed and that the hunter can quickly become the hunted. Slipped silently through the underbrush of the Montana wilderness, his boots leaving faint impressions on the damp earth. The forest whispered around him, its sounds a mix of wind-rustled leaves and the distant call of birds. After years of teaching survival techniques, he had longed for this trip, a return to solitude and the primal simplicity of nature. This was his element, where he felt more alive than in the confines of civilization. The morning had passed uneventfully. Greg tracked the path of a creek, scanning the surroundings for signs of wildlife or landmarks. His movements were automatic, honed by years of experience. He carried little: a sturdy knife, bear spray, and a small pack of essentials. It wasn't supposed to be a challenge, but a celebration of his lifelong connection to the wild. Around midday, Greg came across a fresh elk carcass that tightened his chest. Blood pooled around the massive animal's neck, staining the forest floor. Its ribs had been gnawed open, exposing glistening organs. The scene was a raw testament to the food chain in action, but it wasn't the kill that froze Greg. It was what it meant. Bears often guarded their kills, and this one was fresh. Greg's eyes swept the trees and brush. He saw no sign of movement, but the weight of his realization hung heavy. The forest suddenly felt too quiet. His breathing slowed as he turned, step by deliberate step, retracing his way back along the trail. Then the crack of a branch echoed behind him. He turned sharply, his eyes locking onto the unmistakable silhouette of a grizzly bear. It wasn't just any grizzly. It was a mother, and two cubs lingered in the distance. Her massive frame rippled with power as she locked eyes with him. She snorted, her ears back, and her body language clarified her intention. He was a threat. The charge came before Greg had fully processed the situation. Years of training took over. He dropped his pack and sprinted to the nearest tree, a sturdy pine with low branches. His muscles burned as he scrambled up, pulling himself higher than he'd thought possible in such a short time. From his perch, he could see her below, pacing and growling, the cubs retreating to the safety of the woods. But the bear wasn't giving up. She reared onto her hind legs and batted at the tree trunk with her claws, shaking it violently. Greg gripped the branch, his heart hammering, the rough bark scraping his palms. The bear roared, each guttural sound reverberating in his chest. When the tree swayed with her attacks, a sickening realization hit him. This perch wasn't as safe as he had hoped. Another fierce shake broke his grip, and Greg fell. The impact knocked the air from his lungs, and he barely rolled aside as the bear lunged. Instinct screamed at him to reach for the bear spray, but it had fallen in the scramble. His hand closed instead around his knife, and as the bear charged again, he slashed upward. The blade connected, leaving a shallow cut across her shoulder. She roared, but the injury seemed only to enrage her. She came again, her teeth snapping inches from his face. Greg moved rapidly, rolling and slashing, aiming for her vulnerable underbelly. Pain flared through his leg as her claws raked him, tearing through muscle and fabric. Adrenaline dulled the agony, but Greg knew the damage was severe. He had to think. Panic would kill him faster than the bear. He lashed out again, targeting her snout, a sensitive area. The knife struck true, and she recoiled briefly, giving him the space to crawl toward the fallen bear spray. His fingers closed around the canister, and he unleashed it in a fiery burst directly at her face. The bear released a startled bellow, retreating momentarily as the chemical sting overwhelmed her senses. Greg used the chance to drag himself toward a cluster of dense shrubs, his leg throbbing with every inch gained. The mother grizzly lingered, pawing at her face and shaking her head, but she didn't leave entirely. She stalked the area for long minutes, her growls a reminder of her dominance. Greg pressed himself into the shadows of the undergrowth, every nerve on edge. Blood seeped from his wounds, soaking into the soil beneath him. Eventually, the bear gathered her cubs and lumbered off, though Greg knew better than to relax. He had survived the immediate attack, but the fight was far from over. The gashes on his leg were deep, and he could feel the warm stickiness of blood loss. Infection was another looming threat. He was miles from help, and the nearest sign of civilization was a 3-day trek through the forest. He tore strips from his shirt to bind the wound, applying pressure to stem the bleeding. Every movement was excruciating, but he forced himself to focus. His training demanded action. He couldn't afford to collapse here. Greg fashioned a makeshift crutch from a sturdy branch and began the slow, agonizing process of moving. Hours blurred together as he hobbled through the wilderness, Each step was a battle against pain and exhaustion. His vision swam, and the forest around him seemed to shift and darken. He rationed his water carefully, but his body cried out for rest and sustenance. As the first night fell, Greg found a shallow depression in which to shelter. He gathered what little he could for warmth, his body trembling uncontrollably. The stars above were indifferent to his plight, their cold light a stark reminder of nature's impartiality. By the second day, the fever set in. His leg throbbed with searing heat, and the edges of the wound inflamed despite his crude attempts at cleaning it. Delirium crept in, his mind conjuring images of safety that vanished as quickly as they came. He kept moving, driven by sheer willpower and the fading hope of survival. When a rescue helicopter finally spotted him, Greg was barely conscious. The search team, alerted by his failure to check in days earlier, had found him slumped against a tree, his body weak but alive. The hospital stay was long and grueling. The infection had taken root and several surgeries were required to repair the damage. His leg never fully recovered, leaving him with a permanent limp. Yet, as Greg lay in the sterile confines of the hospital, he felt a strange sense of clarity. The wilderness had shown him its harshest truths, stripping away the illusions of control and dominance he'd once held. Survival wasn't about mastery over nature, but respect for its power and unpredictability. Though he had won this battle, Greg knew it wasn't a triumph. It reminded him of his fragility, a lesson etched into his body and soul. As he stared out the hospital window, he felt humbled and grateful to have emerged from the forest alive.